A person who would kill your love when that love was all you had was not a good person, according to Jacob Morrissey. Even worse if that person was your wife, the person who was supposed to love you more than anyone else. The person who knew you better than anyone else. The person who saw you at your most vulnerable moments. The man who found his way into your heart, into your bones, into your blood, into your soul. 3. Abauno. How much all-consuming love and cancer have in common. Jacob concluded that some kinds of love, like cancer, are benign. Others are malignant. His wife fell into the malignant category, and like cancer, it needed to be cut out and destroyed. And Jacob knew how to do it. It was so perfect that he was sure even she would appreciate the way it was destroyed. And such a great ending. Jacob looked behind the workbench out the window, at the garden outside the window. It was filled with color. The garden of her English cottage, the very one she had spent so much time creating and planting, the one she loved so much, her pride and joy. But she'd abandoned it, too. For her, it would be like coming home. Yes, Jacob decided, it was poetic. Jacob stared at the blank canvas with the brush in his hand for a long time, waiting for it. It was hard to describe. It was an urge, a longing, a tingling in his fingertips, a flutter in his stomach, a longing in his soul, and a need in his gut. It was a clear vision in his mind that guided his hand. Without it, there was no art. Jacob slowly made the 360 turn, looking around the 4 walls of his studio, each stacked with blank canvases. They leaned casually over him, like regulars sitting with glasses of wine in their hands at a premiere. But unlike the careless collectors, they were pinned with preparatory sketches, each one accusing him, urging him to begin. "What?" he shouted to them. "I'm waiting for it, and so are you. If you want to attack someone, attack it." Jacob frowned and threw the brush. It rolled across the floor, stopping just short of one of the censured canvases. He threw the palette to the floor in anger. It fell face down on the floor with a crash. Still unsettled, he kicked it, enjoying the colorful stain it left on the wooden floor. It was the most creative thing he'd accomplished in months. Then Jacob did what he'd done every day since it left him. He went for a walk. He walked down a long, familiar, tree-lined path. The maples were green with new spring growth. Below them, all the way to the gate in the distance, a river of yellow, white, and green flowers flowed. Daffodils. Jacob's feet were in the present, continuing his journey, his mind lagging behind the past. "Hi, please, Jake. Let's do it. Daffodils are such happy flowers, it'll make the house perfect." Jake hid a smile. Perfect was Grace's favorite word. "Oh, the driveway is so long it would take thousands." "True, but they'll multiply, and every year they'll look better and better. They'll multiply with our happiness." Of course he said yes. He always said yes to her. Jacob frowned, looking at the abundance of daffodils. She lied. She'd said they were happy flowers. And he wasn't happy. Dinner consisted of a can of cold baked beans, which he ate sitting on the floor of his studio. Dessert was a handful of dried apples that had become tough from age and exposure to the air. Their leathery texture gave Jacob's jaw a good workout. He thought longingly of the tender, juicy roast Grace had prepared. Jacob threw his head back and sniffed, imagining he could smell his favorite meat roasting in the huge double oven, pork with homemade applesauce. "Babe, you've got to cut it out. Dinner's on the table," Grace whispered into his ear. Jacob flinched, turned his head, and looked back. There was no one there, and certainly not Grace. She'd left months ago. Now, Shelby was getting a roast from Grace that was to die for. "Shelby? Who the hell is a guy with a name like Shelby?" Jacob asked from the empty room. "Miserable, effeminate, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, an art collector with more money than brains, that's who." Jacob snorted, remembering how he'd described the effeminate man who'd stolen his wife. A man of fast cars and even faster women. A banal, bored, jaded millionaire. Ironically, she met Shelby at Jake's last solo show. The bastard had even bought one of Jake's canvases to impress her. He must have really wanted to get into her panties, and he'd shelled out $45,000 for the privilege. Jake froze in place. He couldn't believe what his eyes were telling him. No, his mind screamed silently. She was just as her name predicted, grace in motion. All the curves of her body flowed seamlessly into the movements of the man beneath her. Her back arched sensuously, her breasts thrust forward. Her hands rested on his thighs, her head thrown back, her throat exposed. Her hair reached his thighs and swayed back and forth. Jake knew what it felt like. Even in silhouette, Jake knew the truth of what his mind was trying to deny. It was Grace. His Grace. If he'd been watching an adult movie, he would have found this erotic. But this wasn't a movie. This was his wife, and it was obscene. Jake froze for a long moment, hands pressed to his stomach, witnessing his betrayal, witnessing his death. He tore his gaze away from the horror movie playing out before his eyes and looked at his hands. Jacob raised his hands to eye level. He shook his head. For a moment he was sure he saw blood. His hand grasped the neck of the half-full bottle willingly. She knew what he needed. Lips obeyed and obediently opened to accept and close around the moist opening. His throat protested, but his stomach welcomed the fiery water. Jacob carefully placed the open bottle on the floor, carefully moving it a short distance away, and lay back down. He rolled onto his side, assuming a fetal position. The studio floor was as good a place to sleep as any. The sound of a chainsaw running nearby echoed in Jacob's head. He groaned, both at the sound and at the realization that it was someone calling his cell phone. Why had he chosen that as his ringtone? He wanted to go back to sleep, to a beautiful, meaningless oblivion. And he certainly didn't want to talk to anyone. Not today. Not today. Not ever. The sound went on, growing. Jacob growled and rolled onto his back, reaching for his work pants. Glancing at the screen, he saw that it was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What the hell? Where did the day go? Hello? He barked into the receiver. Jesus, Jake, how can you answer the phone like that? I could be a potential buyer, his agent said. Jacob bristled at his scolding tone. My name is Jacob, Bart. What do you need? I'm busy. Yeah, okay, whatever. I hope the fact that you're busy means you're going to tell me you're okay with your show this summer. Jacob sat down, staring at the blank canvases that stared at him warningly from the opposite wall. Yeah, fine. Everything's great and everything's going according to plan. My best work ever. That's great. Let me know when I can get a photographer over to start cataloging them for the show. Yeah. Sure. Jacob passed out. He looked at the bottle and contemplated returning to oblivion. Just as he reached for the bottle, the chainsaw started up again. He looked at the screen. Grace. Mentally, he considered rejecting the call, but his finger pressed the accept button. Old habits were hard to break. Jake? The soft hesitation in her voice only made Jacob angrier. It was a lie. All of it was a lie. He closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. What do you want, Grace? Shit. Jacob heard her inhale noisily. Are you okay? Are you taking care of yourself? You sound weird. You don't drink too much, do you? What the hell do you care? I care, Jake. I care. Well, I had this weird feeling that you needed me and that I should call. Jacob wasn't fooled. Her concern was an act. Hi. Aren't you just the Mother Teresa of unfaithful wives, caring how the poor schmuck you screwed feels? Jake, you've got to stop verbally attacking me. You need to forget about what happened. We broke up at least a year before I met Shelby. Did we? And you didn't think to tell me about it? It's funny that you were willing to keep living off me and sharing my bed and having sex while we... How did you put it so eloquently? Broke up? I just didn't know how to tell you. Well, I have to commend you for your original approach to the subject. Catching you fucking that faggot was certainly an unequivocal way of telling me what the status of our relationship was. Jake didn't know why he'd returned to the apartment. Perhaps he hoped the visions of the previous evening had been a bad dream. No such luck. She was kneeling on the bed in their Sydney apartment, face down, ass up. Her hair moved back and forth to the beat. The swaying stopped. She wiggled her ass. What do you want, Grace? What do you want, Grace? Repeated the man's voice more firmly this time. You! That's what I thought. Better give my slut what she wants, the man growled, slamming his hips against her raised buttocks. Jake, are you still here? Jacob shook his head, clearing his throat. Yeah, bitch, I'm still here. Please stop being rude to me. I still care about you. I'm calling because I care. Jacob ignored her plea, knowing it was an act. So how's Shelby? He's not here right now. He's away on business. Oh, you better be careful, Grace. Maybe he's on the hunt for some freshly married pussy to seduce. Maybe he's had enough of you. Or is it you? Are you bored? Do you want me to come over and fuck you? Although technically that wouldn't be cheating since we're still married and all. Jake, stop it. I know you're just trying to hurt me. I'm damn right, you bitch. You deserve all those nasty words and more. Jacob was breathing hard like he'd run the whole driveway and back. I know you. I know you still care about me, Jake. Jacob was silent. How about I come over to your place, make you a nice dinner, and we talk about the divorce? Jacob laughed loudly and cynically. What are you going to do, Grace? Poison me so you can have every last dime? Isn't that enough for you, you traitorous bitch? Ripping a man's heart out isn't enough for you? And Grace, I don't love you. I hate you. He heard her sharp sigh, and some tiny, stubborn part of his soul wanted to apologize and comfort her, like when their puppy had been run over by a truck because he'd accidentally failed to close the gate, and she'd been heartbroken. But that feeling lasted only a moment, and it ended with the memory of her parting words, so cruel and sarcastic as she dragged the suitcase to the car. Ignorant weakling, I only married you because I knew you'd be famous, loser. I need a man who can actually fuck me, not one who thinks I'm Dresden fucking porcelain fool. I only wanted you to paint my famous portrait. Without another word, he hung up the phone, cutting off the echoes of the past. He shuffled into the dirty kitchen, pushing aside dirty cups and plates to make room on the bench. From the freezer, he pulled a frozen loaf of bread and, with some effort, cut off 2 slices. He stuck them in the toaster and, while he waited for them to cook, he moved to the pantry and found peanut butter. The toaster beeped, and the smell of toasted bread made his stomach rumble again in anticipation. Jacob roughly spread the pasta on the bread. There was no butter. It had run out more than 3 weeks ago. He took a bite and walked back to the door to the pantry with the toast in his hand. It was that moment when Old Mother Hubbard's pantry seemed abundant. Jacob frowned irritably. Now he would not be able to avoid a trip into town. Jacob's wreck seemed to chew its way into town and spit it out through his anus. He'd enjoyed its power before. Now he didn't. He didn't enjoy anything at all anymore. Well, anything other than alcohol-induced oblivion. He made one stop after another: post office, hardware store, supermarket. He stocked up on all the necessities. Everyone looked at him with pity. Everyone except the cashier. She was flirting. Jacob ignored them all. No sooner had he climbed into his car after running his last errand than he heard the sound of a chainsaw in his pocket. Lifting his butt off the seat and straightening his legs, Jacob was able to pull his phone out of his pants pocket. He checked the screen. It was Grace. Jacob groaned, put his head down on the steering wheel, and tapped it a few times, deciding whether or not to answer. Finally, he took the call. What do you need, Grace? Hey, Jake. How are you? Fun-fucking-tastic. Aren't you going to ask how I'm doing? No. I wish you would. I miss you. Jacob shook his head. Did she really think he believed her shit? Did she really think he'd forgotten her cruel taunts? Where's the lover? He had meetings all day today. Damn, didn't little Gracie get enough attention? Doesn't a lover drop everything he's doing to fulfill your every need, like that last asshole you got involved with? You know, the one who married you and who gave you everything. It's not fair and it's not true. Jacob remained silent, knowing she wouldn't be able to resist trying to explain and justify herself once again. You weren't there for me the last 2 years. I was there every day, Grace. I worked from home, if you remember. You may have been there physically, but mentally and emotionally you weren't there. Your head was filled with art. There was no room for me there. I was lonely. I needed someone. Now you're the one who's being unfair. About 3 years ago, I finally started getting a decent price for my paintings. Instead of selling a canvas for $25,000, I started getting $25,000 plus. And I didn't hear you complaining when that success allowed us to buy a house. Well, the one you called perfect, and an apartment in the city. No, you loved that part of my success. And for someone who was pretty damn lonely, you hit it well. I'm going to finish now, Grace moaned, rocking back and forth on her lover's instrument. Oh, God. Harder, baby, harder. Keep going, don't stop. Each word was another twist of the knife plunged into Jake's heart. When was the last time she'd been this slutty with him? Jake, are you still here? Did you hear a word I said? No, and what's more, I don't want to. Jacob heard her voice warning him not to hang up as he pulled the phone away from his ear and ended the call. The aroma of the lasagna he'd bought at the supermarket smelled pleasant to Jacob. He checked the time, wishing it would go faster so he could eat a proper lunch for the first time in a long time. 10 minutes before he left, his phone rang, and the silence was broken by the sound of a chainsaw. Without looking at the screen, he realized who it was. Was she really going to ruin everything? Hey, Jake, it's me again. Yeah, I figured as much. What do you want now? I want to talk to you, baby. Jacob growled like a cornered animal. Her attempts to manipulate him were enraging him. Don't call me baby. I'm not your damn baby. I'm Jacob, the guy you dumped. You wouldn't be so upset with me, Jake, if you didn't still love me, Grace snapped, her mask slipping. You're just jealous because there's another man in my bed now, and you wish it were still you. Outside the train window, the lush inland forests were replaced by an increasingly dense urban suburb. But Jake didn't notice it all. In fact, he avoided looking out the window, because instead of the scenery, he saw only images of Grace making love, exactly love with another man. He didn't know why, and the pain of it was almost unbearable, but he felt compelled to do it anyway. He followed Grace's lead. He kept hoping that he would witness her ending her affair, that he would hear her tell her lover that she loved her husband too much to continue. This time she said she was going into town for the weekend. He decided to take the train and rent a car so as not to risk Grace recognizing his car. He parked on the opposite side of the narrow street from Shelby Holborn's mini mansion in the trendy suburb of Paddington and waited. He knew Grace would easily beat him to town. The train was much slower than her little sporty Lexus. He'd already been to their apartment in Bondi and made sure that neither she nor her car were there. Jake figured that meant she intended to stay the night at her lover's house. Jake watched Holborn's neighbors return home, walk their dogs, drive off to an unknown destination, and generally go about their business, and as he waited, he was tormented by the question of her choice of lover. Her choice was insulting in itself. The guy was a spoiled pretty boy, a playboy, inherited wealth. Right out of high school, took a high position in the family firm. Everything was handed to him on a platter. What did Grace see in him? Did she honestly believe he'd change his ways for her? That he wouldn't get bored of her like all the other women he'd pursued? Jake may not have had the same level of wealth as Shelby Holborn, but his last 3 exhibitions had grossed over $750,000 each, and he was now a vibrant presence in the art world. Australia's new Brett Whiteley. On top of all that, he was a self-made man. No one handed him anything on a platter, and he wasn't petty, vain, and selfish. His patience had been rewarded, though for Jake, it was bittersweet. He'd been right. She was indeed going to stay the night at her lover's house. He was close enough to see the slit of her cocktail dress almost reach her waist as she stepped out of Holborn's sleek Ferrari. The bastard didn't even have the manners to open the door for her. He was close enough to see that the neckline of the almost dress was so deep that there was no way she was wearing a bra. Worse, he was close enough to overhear their conversation, which had obviously started back in the car. Do you really think I can get that much if it comes to divorce? Jake's jaw dropped in surprise. Divorce? She wanted to divorce him? He thought the decision would be left up to him. He would confront her, she would beg for forgiveness, swear she loved only him and promise to end the affair, and he would decide to forgive. It would be difficult and take time, but for her sake he would try. He loved her enough to give her a second chance. Yeah, easily. I checked the value of both properties. You guys bought at the right time. Real estate prices have skyrocketed since then. And then, you've got dollars in the bank, his own art collection. Holborn was meaningfully silent. Wow, I hadn't even considered his work. Holborn laughed. They'll be worth even more when he's dead. And of course, being still married to him, you'll automatically inherit everything. But what if he doesn't kill himself before the divorce becomes final? You'll still inherit his estate unless he changes his will, and even then you can contest it. Good God, she wanted him dead. She wanted him to commit suicide. The fact that Grace had used the knowledge he had entrusted to her at the beginning of their relationship to drive him to extremes was too much. What kid wouldn't try to kill himself after being told he was the only surviving member of his family after a car accident? The last bit of Jake Morrissey was dead. "Jake, can you at least answer me? I'm Jacob, and no, I can't answer you because I wasn't listening to you." Jacob sensed her anger and frustration. "Well, you better start listening. I'm losing my patience fast. You can't avoid me forever. I can try a good old college tryst." He smiled as the mask of her false sincerity fell again. "Well, at least do it forever then. Go to the top, asshole, and spare us a divorce." Jacob laughed and hung up the phone. Jacob stood in front of his easel, the now familiar frustration bubbling up from his gut. Nothing. No it. Jacob hated Grace for depriving him of it as much as he hated Grace for her betrayal, for her evil desires. He looked to his left, beyond the workbench, out the window at the garden of her cottage. He had often watched her as she worked in the garden. His latest work had been a semi-abstract depiction of her in various guises in the garden surrounding their house. How could she say he wasn't there mentally and emotionally when he'd spent 12 months following her around, drawing her, photographing her, painting her in her favorite gardens? She couldn't. Her words were lies, deliberate lies designed to poison his memories, a deliberate attempt to rewrite their history by making him out to be the villain, all to justify her deception, her greed. A way to justify her infidelity, a way to drive him crazy, drive him to suicide. Jacob grinned. She could lie to herself and everyone else all she wanted. He knew the truth. The truth was that she was a malignant cancer, a cancerous growth in his life. A fantasy of destroying Grace played out in Jacob's mind. He looked at her garden, and as he looked at it, the colors seemed to become even more saturated, the blues more vibrant, the yellows more radiant, the reds deeper and juicier like blood. Even the greens became greener, like moss on a forest floor. Euphoria spilled through my veins, filling my heart, my head, my fingertips. Soon. Jacob reached for the bottle and took a sip, the firewater mixing intoxicatingly with the euphoria. Jacob checked his phone and smiled. 6 messages. He guessed who was calling. He enjoyed frustrating her attempts to talk to him. He hoped her self-control was eroding as quickly as his sanity. He decided to reward himself. After all, he'd gone to the mailbox to get the mail. Maybe he wouldn't read anything, just add a handful to the already huge collection that occupied the office desk. But the fact that he had emptied the mailbox deserved recognition. He sat at the dining room table, reclined in his chair, and drank his coffee. He added alcohol to it and dialed a number to access his messages. "Hey, Jake. It's me. Please call me back, baby. I'm worried about you." Jacob snorted. Who did she think she was fooling with her sweet words? No one. Certainly not him. Jacob waited for the standard voice to tell him the date and time of the second message left on his cell phone. "Jake, it's me again. I know you're here. Please stop ignoring my calls. I need to talk to you. Call me back as soon as you get this message." Jacob smiled, noticing the note of irritation in her tone. Grace wasn't the most patient person, and Jacob knew better than anyone that she hated being ignored. As he waited for the third message, he took a sip of coffee. To his disappointment, it was Bart, his agent, wanting to know how the next show was coming along. Jacob frowned. He'd have to call the leech back and assuage his fears, or Bart was just as likely to show up unannounced, and that was no good. No, absolutely not. Another sip of coffee, another generic introduction about the time and date of message #4. "Jake, you ignorant asshole, you better damn well call me back or you'll regret it. I'm going to make your life a misery." Jacob grinned from ear to ear. Damn, Grace looked upset. Now she was blurting out her messages. And who was it she called an ignorant asshole? At least he always opened doors for her, brought home her favorite chocolates every time he went out of town, and made her coffee every morning, which she sipped while still in bed because she didn't like mornings. Did the handsome Shelby do all that? Jacob thought not. He was probably too busy following in Grandpa and Daddy's footsteps and figuring out what to spend his next $1,000,000 on to bother with such trivial considerations. He certainly wasn't opening car doors for her, and he really liked calling her a whore. Jacob shrugged. Maybe she liked being treated like a cheap whore. Maybe that was where he was wrong. Cherishing her and treating her with love and respect certainly didn't work. Message number 5 was a return to sugary sweetness. A fervent apology full of affection and requests to call her. It should have won her an Academy Award. When Jacob received the last message, he experienced a mental high. He selected the number on the messaging service necessary to repeat the message. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back, savoring the jubilation. "This is it, Jake. My patience is at an end. I will no longer be avoided by anyone. I'm going to the house, and you damn well better be there." Jacob selected the option to save the message. He refilled his coffee, added another shot, and walked into his studio. His gaze immediately went to the window. He put the phone to his ear and listened to Grace's last message. He smiled as he looked at her cottage garden. Soon he promised the flowers, soon she would be home. Jacob heard the car before he saw it. He smiled, jumping out the back door and rounding the side of the house to the side of the cottage where Grace lived. Grabbing a weapon he was sure Grace would appreciate, he found the hidden entrance to the garden, a narrow zigzag path where every turn was cleverly disguised, and cautiously made his way to the grassy center where she had placed a low stone bench. She called it her secret garden, her secret place to think or read or dream. Jacob went there to hide. Behind a wall of shrubbery, Jacob marveled at how cleverly Grace had arranged the garden. A large hill rose slowly in height, and different kinds of flowers were planted in tiers. She had said at the time that it allowed her to grow more varieties, showing them off. The garden looked impenetrable. The top row of gladiolus hid the fact that there was a narrow but deep depression in the center of the mound. If Jacob had wanted to, he could have stood halfway up the side of the hollow and gone unnoticed, and Jacob was 6 feet tall. Instead, he made himself comfortable and waited. He listened for a car approaching. He recognized it as Grace's Lexus. The car stopped, he thought, right behind his car. Unexpected was the sound of 2 car doors opening and closing. Interesting. Jacob wanted to take a look to see if it was the handsome Shelby she'd brought with her. If so, he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He heard voices, too distant to make out the words, but distinct enough to realize that one was male and the other female. Jacob smiled. He closed his eyes so as not to be peripherally distracted, and focused on the sounds, which grew louder as they approached. "He should be here," Grace said. "His car is here. I'll check inside. Maybe you could go around the house and see if he's anywhere outside?" "Sure, babe. I can't wait to see his face when he sees I'm here with you." Jacob grinned. Handsome Shelby might well see more than he expected before the day was over. Grace giggled. "You're so bad, sweetie. You like bad, my little slut?" "Yes, I do. We are a couple made in heaven. Do you think my confronting and mocking him will be enough to piss him off?" Jacob shook his head at Holborn's arrogance. He could only assume that they thought he was in his studio and couldn't hear them. "I hope so. I'm so sick of pretending to care. Do you have any idea how hard it is day after day, year after year, to pretend you're a pretty butterfly when you're really an eagle?" Jacob's lips curled at Grace's metaphor. She wasn't a majestic eagle. She was a hyena, a scavenger ready to pounce on a corpse. "Now who's the bad guy?" Grace giggled again, repeating Holborn's words. "You like the bad. That's why you love me. You and I are alike." Jacob heard the front door open. The walls muffled her voice, but he could make out that she was calling his name. He imagined her going from room to room, her frustration growing when she didn't find him. "Yes, Jakey Poo," Jacob heard Shelby mutter. Come out, wherever you are." Shelby's snide, condescending tone didn't bother Jacob. He knew he'd have the last laugh. He listened, hearing the doors open and close, Grace calling his name. Everything was quiet for a moment, and Jacob wondered where she was. "Shelby?" Jacob had an answer. Jacob realized from the closeness and direction of her voice that she was standing at his workbench, calling to him through the open studio window. "Yes, baby," Shelby answered. Judging by his footsteps, he was approaching from the back of the house. "Did you find him?" "No, I haven't checked that shed in the backyard yet." "It's a pottery shed." There was a pause, and Jacob imagined Shelby's questioning look. The previous owner had been a professional potter. There are 2 state-of-the-art kilns and an electric potter's wheel. He passed away, and we bought the place from his daughter. "I take it he's not in the house?" "No, and you should see the place. It looks like it was hit by a bomb. I don't think he's done the dishes or changed the linens since I left. There are empty bottles everywhere. The trash can is overflowing, and it stinks to high heaven. From the looks of it, he's given up a lot. This might be even easier than we thought." Jacob noticed that Grace was speaking quite calmly. There was no worry in her voice. You'd think she was discussing the weather, not her husband's suicide. "Do you think he's already killed himself?" "I don't know, maybe," Grace said thoughtfully. "He's certainly been talking differently lately, and it's not like him to ignore my calls. Maybe I should check out the pottery barn." "Yes, you can, and I dare you to take another look around the house. He's probably hiding in a closet or under a bed or somewhere equally stupid. All right, I'll meet you back here in 5. Jacob's pulse quickened. His ears were ringing. The time was almost up. He took slow, deep breaths to calm himself. Jacob slipped the weapon into the back pocket of his work pants and moved back down the narrow path as quietly as he could, stopping in front of the entrance and crouching. He flinched when the weapon rested against him and shifted his position slightly to relieve the pressure. He counted down the minutes, anticipating the impatience that would overwhelm him. The muscles in his thighs protested the forced immobility, but he ignored the discomfort. He waited until Shelby was half a meter from his hiding place. "Hey, lover boy, you looking for me?" Jacob asked nonchalantly, getting up and walking out of the garden. Shelby turned around, clearly surprised. He reflexively took a step back. "What the hell? Where?" Shelby fell silent. He shook his head, squared his shoulders, recovered, and took a step forward. "Well, look at you, Jakey boy. Aren't you a sight to behold? Anyone would think you'd lost your wife." Jacob tilted his head to the side as if perplexed. "Wow, I didn't realize you were not only a clown, but also a corporate custodian. That must look good on your resume." "Careful, Jakey boy. You're forgetting who's in charge. I'll give you a hint. It's not you. I already have your wife, and by the way, isn't she sweet? That's a lot of woman for you. A woman like Grace needs a firm hand, not the love crap you've showered her with." Shelby Holborn grinned evilly. "And, Jakey boy, I have to say that after my little trip around your hacienda, I've decided that I really like the idea of a country house. Yes, I think I'll take it too." Jacob smiled. It was more of a thinning of the lips, a baring of the teeth. He stepped forward, shortening the distance between them, and cupped his hand around the weapon in his back pocket. Holborn raised his hands, clenched them into fists, ready to fight. He was too slow. Jacob had entered Shelby's personal space, making it impossible for Holborn to identify Jacob's weapon without breaking eye contact, and Jacob was sure he wouldn't. Too bad, Jacob thought. I wish I could see the realization of his imminent death in his eyes. Oh well, you can't have everything. Jacob stabbed the garden fork, its tines carefully sharpened, into the soft flesh of Shelby's belly. And she was soft. The boy should have spent more time doing belly exercises. With one hand, Jacob angled the fork upward, pressing hard, aiming to pierce Shelby Holborn's heart. Apparently, the weight of the man's heart was indeed through the stomach. He would have preferred to rip out his heart. It would be more symmetrical that way, but piercings would have to do. With his other hand, he covered his mouth, muffling his screams. He stared intently into Holborn's eyes, enjoying the expression of shocked horror. Holborn's hands clutched at Jacob's arms as if trying to hold him down. Jacob brought his face so close to Holborn's that their noses were almost touching. He gave him a deliberately mad look. "Get the fork, Holborn." Jacob laughed happily at the play on words, and he was sure that even Martin Riggs, Mel Gibson's character in Lethal Weapon, would have been pleased at his cleverness. "Shelby? Jake?" Grace's voice distracted Jacob from his joke for a moment. He looked over Holborn's shoulder and smiled at his wayward wife. "Hello, Grace. How nice of you to drop in on your lover." When Grace took a step forward with a confused look, Jacob gave one last push. Holborn's last exhale washed over his face. Jacob wrinkled his nose. Ugh, this guy had eaten garlic recently. Jacob felt pressure on his wrist as Holborn's knees buckled. He pulled out a garden fork, and Holborn collapsed at his feet like a puppet with its strings cut. Grace shifted her gaze from her lover to Jacob's hand. "Oh my God! Jake, what have you done?" "I thought it was obvious," Jacob replied, grinning. "I picked up my lover's fork. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about, so I stabbed him. You're right. It's fun. It's a little dirty, but yeah, it's fun." "Oh my God, oh my God," Grace repeated over and over, backing away from him. Jacob stepped around Holborn's motionless body. Grace took another step back, Jacob took another step forward. The faster Grace retreated, the faster Jacob moved forward. Grace shook her head. Jacob nodded his head. Then she turned and ran. Jacob darted in pursuit. Adrenaline pulsed in his veins, and he realized what it was to be a lion chasing a gazelle. It was intoxicating. He closed the gap, adjusting his grip on the garden fork. Sprinting at full speed, he boomeranged the fork at Grace's legs and grinned as she fell face first onto the lawn a meter away from the car. In a moment, Jacob was on top of her, flipping her over onto her back and riding her, pinning her arms to her sides with his hips. He squeezed her tightly, risking a sideways lean to reach for a garden fork. "Loverboy said you like it rough, that you need a firm hand." "Well, how do you like it, Grace?" "Jake, don't, please don't," she whimpered, clearly frightened. "I'm not Jake. I'm Jacob." "What? Jake? Please don't hurt me. You love me. I know you love me." "Read my lips, bitch. My name is Jacob. I'm not Jake. Jake loved you. I didn't. Oh, God, he loved you so much. He was the only person who cared about you. You were his reason to breathe. And how did you repay his loyalty? You fucked him. You killed him." Grace sobbed, rolling her head from side to side. "Jake, you're not making any sense. Please, listen to me. You're not this Jacob. You're Jake Morrissey. You're my husband, and you love me. Just like I love you. Just like I've always loved you. I came here today to apologize to you." Jacob laughed. "Nice try, bitch. That's why you brought your lover. Was he going to apologize too? Yeah, you loved Jake. Of course I did. That's why you spent months trying to throw him off balance. You tried to kill the guy who gave you everything. But even then, you and your lover didn't have the guts to do it on your own. You wanted Jake to do it for you. The guy who gave you the perfect house with the perfect garden. Tried to be the perfect husband and give you the perfect life. And what did you give him? You're Jake, you love me," she sobbed. "No, I don't. When Jake looked into your eyes, do you know what he thought he saw? An angel. A sweet and perfect angel. You're Jake, not Jacob." Grace wriggled and twitched, trying to get free, but Jacob sat on her like a rodeo cowboy, and his weight was too much for her to throw off. "Do you want to know what I see when I look into your eyes?" Grace whimpered, tearfully repeating her earlier words. "You're Jake, Jake Morrissey, and Jake is gentle and kind. Jake loves me. You are not Jacob. I see a cancerous tumor. What do we do with malignant tumors?" Like a broken record, Grace sobbed. "You're Jake, Jake Morrissey, and you love me. We cut them out. That's what we do." With those words, Jacob pierced the cancer's lying eyes. Jacob whistled as he mixed Holborn's ashes with the fertilizer of blood and bones. The daffodils would be thrilled with the upcoming fertilizer, just as the cottage garden had fallen in love with Grace. The thought of Grace in the garden reminded Jacob that he needed to move the sprinkler. Mentally, he ticked off the to-do list. Delete Grace's phone messages. Check. Drive the Lexus to Sydney disguised as Grace. Check. Sneak into Sydney apartment and leave signed divorce papers. Check. Dispose of Grace and Holborn's cell phones along with the disguise. Check. Using the second disguise to get on the train. Check. Disposing of the second disguise. Check. Vacuum the inside of the stoves. Check. Wash the inside of stoves with bleach. Check. Clean the chimneys of the stoves. Check. Make dishes for kiln firing and use in artwork. Check. Scatter grass seed around killing areas, fertilize, and water. Check. Clean the house from top to bottom. Check. Shower, shave, and cut hair. Check. Show up to town again looking normal and healthy. Check. 3 weeks passed before the police approached him with questions about the disappearance of his wife and Shelby Holborn. Jacob couldn't do anything to help them except confirm their affair. A week later, they returned with a search warrant. They even took small samples from the finished canvases to see if Jacob had put blood in the paint. Obviously, they didn't know anything about paints. Blood would eventually spoil and ruin the colors. So despite their best efforts, they found nothing. The case remained open. Bart was thrilled with the paintings for Jacob's next show and said they were his best work. He lyrically commented on Jacob's vibrant color scheme and use of ceramic shards, giving the canvases an almost three-dimensional look. He told Jacob that he would use words like kaleidoscope and quasi-mosaic in the exhibition's flyer. He didn't say it in so many words, but he let Jacob know that his recent notoriety wouldn't hurt his sales. He even predicted that sales at the expo would exceed the $1 million mark. Jacob, on the other hand, was just happy to have it back. Oh, and the daffodils really liked the Holborn fertilizer.